We are now excited to welcome Bill Weld and Matt Welsh. Yeah. So most of you will know our next two speakers, but for those of you who don't, let me enlighten you. Matt Welsh has been a libertarian figurehead for quite some time and now serves as Reason's editor-at-large. And Bill Weld was the Libertarian Party's VP candidate with Gary Johnson. He is a two-term Republican governor of Massachusetts and has been a dear friend of SFL for several years. Please join me in welcoming Matt Welsh and Bill Weld.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me? Can you hear me? Nod your heads. Thanks. Always have doubts. So sorry we didn't get the an armed bank robber up this time, although he did serve as a U.S. attorney for a long time, so I guess close enough. Reminder, you can get me on Twitter at Matt Welch for questions to ask Governor Weld. Let's just start with the headlines. While everyone was out partying for lunch here, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, announced at the White House that he wants to give DACA recipients an extra 3 years of protection in exchange if Democrats will give him $5.7 billion to extend the wall and the border fencing, and the government shutdown would end. Irrespective, which I don't think is a word, of whether that's great policy overall in terms of immigration, is that a deal Democrats should take? Bill Weld.
No, 3 years is not long enough, and I'm kind of a DACA hawk. I was very much in favor of the DACA protections. Ugly is the means, constitutionally ugly is the means of their institution might have been. So that's a important issue to me. The 5.7 billion for the wall, you know, does the president have the authority under the Constitution to say that's a national emergency? Yes, he has the authority. There are 30 national emergencies out there still pending that past presidents have announced. Would it be an abuse of his power, an abuse of his authority to say that this little wall here is a national emergency? Yeah, probably yes. And people get all tangled up these days. They're saying, well, the president has you know, the absolute power to grant a pardon, therefore nothing he does dangling a pardon in front of a person who's a defendant in crime in order to get them to go around behind the prosecutors and get information to bring back to the president, that, you know, that could be a crime. That could be bribery, trading information for something which is something of value to the president for something that's of value to the convict. So you can't stop right at the president having the power. And I thought Liz Holtzman totally was on the correct side of that in her critique of my good friend Bill Barr's memo. So no, I wouldn't have taken 3 years if I was the Dems. On the other hand, you know, I think the president could do it and run for luck all by himself if he wanted to, in terms of raw power. Whether it's a good idea or not, whether it's abuse of power or not, that's a separate question. You think he'd be tangled up in courts immediately if he declared the national emergency? Well, sure, be tangled up, but what I said still stands. Yeah. So a lot of people might have forgotten, especially if you weren't born yet, but Bill Weld was nominated to be the U.S. ambassador to Mexico in the mid-1990s. A little bit of controversy around that nomination back then, but clearly you've thought about, and you remember the Council of Foreign Relations, you travel a lot, you've thought about immigration issue, U.S.-Mexico relations. What does our politics and this current administration, but certainly not only this current administration, get wrong about immigration right now? Well, I think what happened is that the people who were anti-free immigration set up this boogeyman, this straw man, and they said there are 11 million undocumented aliens, like space creatures, in our midst, and they're all going to become citizens and eat all our food and marry our daughters, and you know, they're going to really influence the American way of life for the worse. They don't have to be citizens. There doesn't have to be a path to citizenship. You could bring in, what we should have really is a much more robust guest workers program like Canada has. Because in the western states of this country particularly, you really need the immigrant labor from the south through the Mexican border, but it's Central Americans as well, to make two big industries work. That's the construction industry and the agriculture industry. And that's not going to hurt anybody. And P.S., a lot of these Mexicans and Central Americans, they don't want to move to the United States. They want to come up here and work doing the building or the growing season 4 months and then go back to their families. Sure, they want to send the remittance check back, but you know, that's labor for jobs that almost by definition, you're not going to find Americans who want to fill those jobs. That's very simple. It doesn't involve the boogeyman of everybody becoming citizens. We also need to increase the number of EB-5 and HB-1 visas for people who are willing to start a company or people who are particularly privileged. Otherwise, we're just educating our competition at MIT, and they're all going back to their countries.
One of the kind of framing devices, I think, or themes that has come up from opening night here at this conference with a lot of people from all over the world is that on one hand, the last 3 decades has been the most single marvelous economic story in history, with 1 billion people leaving extreme poverty, and just the numbers are incredible by every possible measure. There's way more free people in 2019 than there were in 1989, God knows. And at the same time, the last 5 years, let's say, or whatever you might put the timing on it, we've seen this rise in populism, in nationalism, in a kind of mercantilist idea. Kind of big picture, what is your go-to explanation for that seeming paradox? And do you think it's going to get worse before it gets better?
Oh, I think the nationalist rise is ugly. Charles de Gaulle, great president of France, said that patriotism is when love of your people comes first. Nationalism is when hatred of all people other than your people come first. I think that's right.
But why? Why is it happening, do you think? Why are we in this moment of prosperity, do we seem to be snarling and clawing at the engine of it?
Well, the Le Pens and the Trumps of the world, I mean, they obviously, I won't say feed on, but they campaign based on the frustration that comes from changes in the workforce. And not everybody is a winner in the global sweepstakes, but you can address that by sound public policy. You can say, okay, you don't have the skill sets that you're going to need after robotics and artificial intelligence and drones and machine learning and electric and autonomous vehicles come in. 40% of the jobs that are in the United States right now won't be there in 15 years, but it doesn't mean they won't be replaced. But government could take a role in making sure that workers who are losing those jobs can acquire the skill sets that the new jobs are going to require. You have to take your head out of the sand. It requires a certain amount of prioritizing and shifting, but it can be done.
There's a thing commonly referred to as sort of the Washington consensus, which is a loose term, but I'm just going to go ahead and tar you with it anyways. But just the post-World War II kind of liberal international order of coming together multinationally, lowering tariffs over time, having kind of a US-led friendly hegemony or whatever through NATO and all of this. You could definitely say this order led materially towards prosperity. But what did it get wrong? And is part of what it got wrong, or what did it get wrong in such a way that helped provoke this backlash, do you think?
One thing it didn't get wrong was free trade and not having tariffs and sanctions be your first recourse. That's a really bad idea. Free trade, among other things, always benefits the United States because we have the most productive workers and economy in the world. I think, you look at the IMF and the World Bank over the years, is there a certain amount of elitism and we're going to tell these southern countries what to do? Absolutely. So, I think we have to have some sympathy for, we're the North, right? For the South, the lesser developed countries, to whom we're saying, well, we've had our cake. We had the Industrial Revolution. We've completely industrialized. We've crossed the goal line there. You're still on the opposing 2-yard line, but you have to sign the same sort of percentage of climate change promises to do better in 2050 that we do. No, that's not fair as a matter of elemental justice. And I think just as, I care a lot, as you know, about social justice with neighborhoods and ethnic minorities in the United States, I think, you got to put a big hat on if you're running the United States of America And think about that for the rest of the world as well. Not that we got to give away the store, but just be conscious of their position and where they've come from and where they are now.
One thing people don't realize about you is that you got part of your start in law, especially working for the House Judiciary Committee, I believe, on the Watergate hearings back in the 70s, in addition to being a U.S. attorney in Massachusetts. So I think you might have a little bit of a more interesting speculation about things involving the Mueller investigation and Donald Trump than the average person. Where do you think this goes right now?
And I would just say Bob Mueller was my deputy in the Justice Department. I brought him from San Francisco to Boston to be head of my criminal division, and he became my deputy. He succeeded me as U.S. Attorney. He succeeded me as Assistant Attorney General in charge of the criminal division in Washington. So I know him well. He is the straightest guy I've ever met in my life. He is a Republican, but he doesn't have a political bone in his body when it comes to law enforcement. He's just strictly by the book. You know, so far, so good. I'm not absolutely sure that, as people have been saying recently, that the Mueller report won't be anticlimactic compared to the expectations of some, at least in the media. But, you know, there's plenty of other stuff. I mean, so the Nixon impeachment was based really on obstruction of justice and undermining the rule of law, because he sent in Haldeman and Ehrlichman to say, tell the FBI, tell the CIA, this is national security. They should quash the Watergate investigation. Well, honestly, hasn't our incumbent done 6 times that much in public with Manafort and the investigations? So, you know, I spent, and I should apologize in this hall, but I don't really apologize. I spent 7 years in the Justice Department trying to do justice without fear or favor. And we were on the wrong side of some issues. Some of the sentencing issues, such as been you know, covered in part by the recent criminal justice reform bill, and I think they need to go further if you want to talk about that. But some things we got right, which was always insisting on the rule of law, and that's why I resigned from the Justice Department in 1988.
Let's talk a little bit about where we should go next with criminal justice reform after the First Step Act, which is the first step after all. I think it's fair to say that your views have evolved somewhat from being a prosecutor.
Quite a lot on sentencing. I think there's two things still out there to do. One is, as I've urged in an earlier panel, the social justice impact of the war on drugs on various communities, minority communities versus white communities, is staggering. If you're in a minority community, you're 4 times as likely to get arrested for a marijuana offense, 4 times as likely to get jail time after you're arrested. Your sentence is likely to be 4 times as long. That's not even that's a 64x multiple, not an 8x multiple. And you know, I think we need to perhaps have some statutory recognition of this, and you could permit people at post-sentencing hearings to file what's called in the law a Brandeis brief, a brief not with a lot of law, but with statistics, and therefore, Your Honor, this should happen. You could open that up, and that would be, I think, a good retroactive move. The other one that's one I spend time on is in the healthcare area, treating addiction. And okay, so maybe some of the consequences of addiction, but treating that as a criminal justice priority as opposed to a public health emergency in the United States, which is what it is a grave error.
Let's go to a Twitter question here. Real Nick Cooper, not the fake Nick Cooper, asks thoughts on Trump's AG appointee, William Barr.
Well, I've known Bill Barr a long time, and he's a strong guy and a tremendous lawyer. I thought that his 19-page memo got a little bit close to not the divine right of kings, but it did say if the president has a power to do something, further to what I was saying a minute ago, like grant a pardon or declare a national emergency, Bill Barr's memo almost seemed to say you can't go behind the reasons for that. And former Congresswoman Elizabeth Holtzman has been very persuasive in attacking that and saying that cannot be the law, because if it were, then there would be no check on an abusive commander-in-chief who abused those powers. And abuse of power is what the impeachment clause is all about.
Let's go to another one here. I'm going to botch your name. Duncan, something like that. Sorry. Is Bill Weld, this is the question that everyone wants to ask, is Bill Weld running for president in 2020?
Yeah, as most of you in this room know, I made the rounds of state conventions, Libertarian Party conventions, and I'm very interested in 2020. Lately, I've become more and more concerned about what's going on in D.C. It seems to me that you know, certain actions seem to me to go beyond a lack of stability, which, as you know, I complained about throughout the 2016 cycle, maybe even crossing the line into deranged decision making. So that has my full attention at the moment, but I'm going to be involved in 2020.
Now, we heard last night on this stage Justin Amash say a couple of interesting things on this topic. One is that the Libertarian Party needs to make sure it doesn't nominate some Republican squish out there.
That would be me.
But two, he wasn't ruling it out himself. So question to you, should he run?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And would you then not run if he did?
No, I've never encouraged anybody not to run, and I wouldn't promise to do something based on what somebody else did, but Justin is a hero, and I think he absolutely should run. There's at least one other person whose name you all know who's thinking about, not me, who's thinking about running for the top spot in 2020, and it's a he. I would encourage.
McAfee. He's busy with some whales right now.
I would encourage him to run as well, but I think it helps the L party if there's, you know, 3, 4 strong contenders up there who have, this is not going to be popular, but something that they've done of accomplishment other than strictly in the libertarian vertical.
Now, I saw you, I think, about a month before the midterm elections up in Massachusetts, and your theory of the case was the Libertarian Party in 2018, this past November, needs a lot of second place finishes, needs a lot of people to do pretty well so that you can tell the story to the media. Hey, look, you know, there's places where the Republicans or the Democrats have withered away and we're coming up. 2018 midterms were kind of a disaster.
Oh no, it was very disappointing. We had some second place finishes, but they were way down ballot. I mean, I was very much hoping we'd get some at the statewide and senatorial level, and it just didn't happen.
The number that jumped out at me down in New Mexico with Gary Johnson, your friend, who got what, 15, 16%, yeah. Which is, you guys got 9% there in that state. It's his state. He ran against absolutely nobody as the Republican candidate there, who beat him by 2-1 in New Mexico. But the stat that came out—
When he started out, Gary was ahead of him by 2-1.
Right, so it flipped. But early voting there, about a week or 10 days before the election, you could see that 15% of all Democrats, more or less, had already voted. Bill? 15% of Republicans had already early voted, but only 7% of independents and third-party members had used early voting. The passion is in negative polarization. The passion is in hate. So when you have a huge high turnout, like you did, this is the largest turnout in midterms since God knows when, before my parents were born, then they don't go third party.
No, I'll say one last thing in 10 seconds. I think one mistake that Gary and I might have made in 2016 is we put enormous emphasis on the villainy of the duopoly and how the R's and the D's and the Reds and the Blues, that's really awful. But we were almost arguing you have to vote for us because we're coming right up the middle of the highway. That's almost as bad as what the R's and D's do. They say you have to vote for us. So this time, I think the L's in 2020, we got to stop dribbling around the court with these indirect arguments. We got to run right for the hoop.
All right, with that basketball analogy, thank you to Bill Weld, and thank you everybody else.